From the scorching deserts of Iraq and the rugged mountains of Syria to the icy bamboo groves along the North Korean border, wherever there's been a hotspot, the image of American troops has not been far behind. For more than 7 decades, Washington's shadow has never truly left the world's flashpoints. It's no coincidence that the United States has long been dubbed the global police force, a title that carries both the prestige of power and the weight of fierce controversy. However, that era may be drawing to a close. In recent years, a series of signals has indicated that the U.S. is gradually scaling back its role on the global stage. The withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, Washington's cautious stance in response to the war in Ukraine, and most recently, the January 2025 declaration to retreat from its global intervention policy have all marked a historic pivot. This shift is not merely a military strategy. It represents a profound transformation in how the United States views its own role, from a nation willing to send troops across the globe to maintain order to a more cautious superpower, focused on defense and carefully weighing every international step. It is, in many ways, the result of a long internal reckoning. After prolonged, costly, and polarizing wars like those in Iraq and Afghanistan, the American public has grown weary. The calls to defend global freedom no longer resonate with average voters in Iowa or Michigan, people more concerned with gas prices, healthcare costs, and their children's future than events in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the world is changing. Other powers are rising. China, Russia, Iran are no longer peripheral challengers, but major players eager to expand their influence. In this new landscape, spreading military forces thinly across the globe is no longer a strategic advantage. It has become a liability. Another driving force behind the shift is the evolving definition of security. Today's threats don't just come from missiles or tanks, but also from cyberspace, biological viruses, economic meltdowns, and climate change. Faced with these new perils, maintaining hundreds of thousands of troops overseas no longer offers an effective solution. That's why when the U.S. Vice President announced in January 2025 that America will withdraw from its global intervention policy, many saw it as the official end of an era in which the U.S. operated like a modern empire, using military might to protect its interests or enforce a global order. Of course, this retreat does not mean the U.S. is giving up its global influence. It remains the world's leading power in economics, technology, and military strength. However, it will now choose to intervene in more sophisticated ways, through strategic aid packages, diplomatic pressure, cyber warfare, or proxy conflicts via allies. In short, the beginning of this new chapter is not a surrender, but a repositioning. America is not stepping back out of weakness, but to restructure, focusing its resources where they truly matter. From being the global police, it now aims to become the architect of post-intervention order, less noisy, but no less powerful. When people talk about global intervention, what often comes to mind are tanks rolling in, U.S. troops landing on foreign soil, or terrifying airstrikes on distant cities like Baghdad, Kabul, or Tripoli. However, in reality, global intervention is not just about guns and bombs. It is a complex system of tools, military, diplomatic, economic, and media-related, employed to achieve a nation's strategic goals beyond its own borders. In the case of the United States, the concept of global intervention carries a distinct nuance. This is a country with the largest military force in the world, an extensive network of allies, and a set of universal values such as freedom, human rights, and democracy, often used as the moral justification for its interventions. So, what exactly does global intervention entail? Military intervention, the traditional spearhead. This is the most recognizable and also the most controversial form of intervention. From the Korean War 1950 and the Vietnam War 1965 to operations in Iraq 2003, Afghanistan 2001, and Syria 2014, the U.S. military has directly engaged in conflicts across dozens of countries, often under the banners of protecting international order, fighting terrorism, or rescuing democracy. The U.S. military base network currently spans more than 80 countries, with over 750 installations. From Japan and South Korea to Germany, Qatar, Djibouti, and even Guam, this global presence is not only meant to protect allies, but also provides a strategic advantage, allowing rapid response to any emerging crisis. Economic intervention, aid or sanctions, two sides of the same coin.
If you're a poor country, the U.S. may approach you with a generous aid package, often tied to conditions such as institutional reforms, economic liberalization, or political democratization. On the other hand, if you're seen as an adversary, Washington can impose harsh economic sanctions, ranging from trade embargoes and asset freezes to cutting off access to the global financial system via SWIFT. For example, Iran and Venezuela are currently under heavy U.S. sanctions, plunging their economies into deep crisis. Meanwhile, dozens of countries across Africa and Eastern Europe receive development aid paired with military training programs and governance reforms aligned with Western standards.
Diplomatic intervention. Soft power in a polished disguise. Intervention doesn't always come with tanks. Washington often chooses a gentler path, exerting pressure through negotiations, manipulating international organizations like the United Nations or the WTO, or deploying special envoys to influence other countries' policy decisions. For example, the US has used diplomatic pressure to bring Iran to the negotiating table over its nuclear program. It has also played a major role in shaping leadership appointments at global financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. Media and technology intervention, the ideological battlefield of the modern age. This is a front that often goes unnoticed, yet wields enormous influence. Outlets like Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and hundreds of foreign-based non-governmental organizations, NGOs, serve as extended arms of Washington, spreading democratic ideals, promoting human rights, and exporting American values. In addition, major US tech companies such as Google, Meta, and Twitter, now X, also play a role in shaping the global flow of information. Modern media intervention goes far beyond propaganda. It includes algorithm control, data manipulation, and influencing public opinion in other countries. In summary, global intervention is not merely about sending troops into battle. It is a strategic toolkit designed to safeguard American interests anywhere in the world. When Washington chooses to scale back the use of these tools, whether for financial, political, or moral reasons, the global order will inevitably have to adjust in response. In summary, global intervention is not merely about sending troops into battle. It is a strategic toolkit designed to safeguard American interests anywhere in the world. When Washington chooses to scale back the use of these tools, whether for financial, political, or moral reasons, the global order will inevitably have to adjust in response. To understand why the U.S. retreat from its global intervention policy is causing such widespread concern, we need to look back at the 80-year journey of intervention by this superpower. From the Korean Peninsula to the deserts of Iraq, from the jungles of Vietnam to the war-torn lands of Syria, each conflict marks a chapter in the post-World War II history of American power. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as two rival superpowers locked in an ideological struggle known as the Cold War. In this context, the U.S. viewed containing communism as its top priority, and military intervention became an indispensable tool. The Korean War, 1950-1953, was the first shot fired. Under the banner of defending democracy, the U.S., along with the United Nations, sent troops to the Korean Peninsula to confront North Korean and Chinese forces. Although the war ended in a stalemate, it set a crucial precedent for a series of future interventions. Next came the Vietnam War, the pinnacle of American-style military intervention. Over 3 million American troops were deployed, and hundreds of billions of dollars were poured into the Indochina battlefield with the goal of preventing the domino effect of communism. Yet, despite its superiority in weapons and technology, the U.S. was forced to withdraw in bitterness in 1975. This war left deep scars on the American psyche and sparked a powerful anti-war movement that would last for years. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States was left without a rival of equal stature. The world entered a unipolar era, with Washington at the center of the global order. However, instead of pulling back, the U.S. continued its interventionist policy, this time in the name of peacekeeping, counterterrorism, and human rights protection. The first Gulf War, 1991, was a prime example. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait, the U.S. led an international coalition in a swift counteroffensive, pushing back Iraqi forces within weeks. This campaign showcased the superior combat capabilities of the U.S. military, from precision airstrikes to multinational operational coordination. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, U.S. intervention policy entered a new phase, one marked by boldness, but also fraught with risk. The 20-year war in Afghanistan is the clearest example. The U.S. launched the campaign with the aim of eliminating al-Qaeda and toppling the Taliban. But after 2 decades, thousands of American troops killed, and billions of dollars spent, the U.S. withdrew in chaos, and the Taliban returned to power in 2021. The original objectives were not achieved, and America's global image suffered significant damage. Not long after, in 2003, the U.S. launched another military campaign, this time in Iraq, aiming to topple Saddam Hussein based on claims, later proven false, that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. Although Saddam was removed, Iraq quickly descended into chaos and civil war, becoming fertile ground for the rise of terrorist organizations like ISIS. In the 2010s, the U.S. shifted to a model of indirect intervention, to reduce casualties and costs. In Syria, the U.S. did not deploy large numbers of troops as in previous conflicts, but instead relied on airstrikes, special forces, and support for rebel groups fighting against both ISIS and the Assad regime. The result was a prolonged conflict involving multiple powers, including Russia, Iran, and Turkey, turning Syria into a quote-unquote miniature international battlefield. In Libya, NATO, led by the United States, intervened in 2011 to support the uprising against Gaddafi. Although Gaddafi was overthrown, Libya descended into lawlessness, with armed factions vying for control and the country becoming a major hub for transcontinental human trafficking. In Somalia, the U.S. maintained a military presence to combat al-Shabaab, an extremist group affiliated with al-Qaeda. However, the results have been limited, as conflict persists and the central government remains weak and fragmented.
From full-scale wars to indirect conflicts, from massive troop deployments to precision airstrikes, the history of U.S. intervention is a story of constant evolution. Yet, in any form, the ultimate goal has remained the same: to protect national interests and maintain superpower status. America's willingness to send troops wherever crises erupted was not just a demonstration of strength. It was also a reflection of belief that the U.S. held an indispensable role in shaping the world order. The United States once stepped onto the world stage as the global police, a superpower willing to deploy troops anywhere in the name of protecting the so-called international order. However, that role has come at a steep price. Thousands of soldiers killed, hundreds of billions of dollars spent, and a prolonged fatigue within American society have led many to ask, are we truly fighting for freedom? Or are we simply sinking deeper into a cycle of endless wars?
Wars like those in Iraq and Afghanistan may have looked like swift victories at first. The Taliban regime collapsed within weeks, Saddam Hussein was toppled in less than a month. But the real question was never how to win the war, but rather what comes next. After the initial combat phase came chaotic nation building. The U.S. had to reconstruct government institutions in countries devastated by bombing campaigns, while also facing unforeseen consequences. Ethnic tensions flaring, insurgent groups emerging, rampant corruption, and increasingly fierce resistance from local populations. In Afghanistan, after 20 years of presence and more than 2,400 American lives lost, the U.S. withdrew in 2021 under chaotic conditions, with evacuation planes taking off as thousands clung desperately to their wheels. The Taliban, America's original enemy in the war, returned to power. So much blood, so much money, for what?
The consequences were not just abroad. The long wars left deep wounds inside America. War spending inflated the national budget and skyrocketed public debt. Meanwhile, domestic infrastructure crumbled, healthcare and education remained underfunded, and public dissatisfaction grew. The anti-war movement was no longer just a relic of the 1960s. Over the past 2 decades, protests demanding troop withdrawals, cuts to military aid, and reductions in defense spending have erupted across the country, from Columbia University to the halls of Congress. One recent example is the massive protest at Columbia University in May 2025, where thousands of students gathered to oppose U.S. support for Israel's military campaign in Gaza. They called for divestment from defense contractors and condemned the turning of conflict into a profit-driven enterprise of blood and tears.
Endless wars have also forced American politicians to adapt. Donald Trump's 2016 election win was fueled in part by his America First rhetoric, promising to steer the country away from Middle East entanglements. Joe Biden, in 2020, gained traction by vowing to end forever wars and rebuild America from within. Though their approaches differed, both men reflected a shifting political mindset. It's time to pull back. It's time to prioritize Americans, instead of bleeding lives and treasure for conflicts halfway around the world. Public opinion polls over the years have shown a steady decline in support for overseas military actions. Americans are increasingly skeptical about the effectiveness of war, and less willing to see their children used as pawns in risky geopolitical games. For nearly a century, U.S. foreign policy largely reflected the behavior of a proactive superpower, initiating attacks, deploying troops worldwide, and intervening in any region deemed a threat to global peace. However, in the 21st century, especially after the heavy toll in the Middle East, the U.S. has entered a new phase: cautious defense. This shift didn't happen overnight. It's been a long process of adjustment, beginning under President Barack Obama, accelerating under Donald Trump, and becoming more apparent in recent years under the Biden administration.
Though each president had a different approach, they shared a common understanding. The U.S. can no longer act like a global policeman from the Cold War era. In the past, the U.S. was willing to send hundreds of thousands of troops into Iraq. Today, it favors precision weapons, drones, special operations forces, and cyber capabilities.
The objective is no longer full-scale military victory, but to, quote, minimize losses and maximize effectiveness.
A prime example is the targeted drone strikes against ISIS leaders in Syria and Iraq, often carried out by MQ-9 Reapers, or special forces working with local allies. Gone are the images of tank convoys rolling across the desert. In their place, a shadow war waged remotely, where the push of a button in Nevada can trigger a shockwave in the Middle East.
Rather than direct confrontation, the U.S. increasingly employs proxy warfare. It trains, equips, funds, and shares intelligence with local forces, those who will fight in its place. In Ukraine, the U.S. has sent tens of billions of dollars worth of military aid, from HIMARS rocket systems to Patriot missile defenses, without deploying troops. In Syria, it supported the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, in fighting ISIS and curbing Iranian influence, without occupying a single inch of territory. The advantage of proxy warfare is that it allows the U.S. to shape outcomes without domestic political fallout or direct accountability. But it also comes with risks: lack of control, unreliable allies, and prolonged unresolved conflicts.
Beyond military tools, Washington increasingly relies on soft levers such as economic sanctions, tech restrictions, and diplomatic isolation to constrain adversaries. Instead of sending troops to Asia to contain China, the U.S. tightens restrictions on semiconductors, curbs investments, and builds economic alliances like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPF. Instead of punishing Iran with missiles, the U.S. suffocates its economy via SWIFT exclusion and oil sanctions. In Russia's case, Washington implemented unprecedented financial sanctions after Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, effectively cutting Russia off from much of the global financial system. This is a strike without marching strategy, showing resolve while avoiding direct military entanglement.
The U.S. isn't just changing its behavior, it's reshaping its military structure. It is reducing traditional large-scale bases in favor of more mobile special ops teams, rapid reaction forces, and unmanned fleets. Notably, Washington is pivoting toward the Indo-Pacific, which it views as the strategic front line of the 21st century. Strengthening alliances with Japan, India, and Australia, re-establishing military ties with the Philippines, and deepening cooperation with Taiwan are all part of this new strategy, to contain Beijing without starting a war.
The prevailing U.S. doctrine is to avoid wars that are aimless, endless, and strategically dubious. No longer the first to deploy troops, the U.S. now acts as a more cautious superpower, ready to strike, but only when necessary, and in direct service of its national interests. Yet this also raises questions. Can a standoff strategy maintain global influence, or is the U.S. gradually relinquishing its central role in world affairs? From a frontline warrior, America is becoming the one who redesigns the game. But can a strategy with less blood and fewer bullets truly preserve the order it once bled to build? The answer will lie in what comes next.
America's central role in global intervention was not just a product of its power, but of the world's familiarity with its presence, whether welcomed or resented. A turbulent Middle East, a rising Asia, or an Africa struggling to find its path, all in some way shaped their dynamics around Washington's looming influence. But as the U.S. begins to scale back its interventionist activities, the world cannot remain still. Without America, the old order may begin to waver. Yet this also presents an opportunity for a new order to emerge. One where regional organizations, developing nations, and even once marginalized actors begin to assert a stronger voice.
One of the most tangible effects of America's withdrawal is the weakening of extremist movements that long relied on anti-American narratives for recruitment and legitimacy. For decades, groups like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS used resistance against America as their ideological foundation, justifying violence, attracting followers, and portraying themselves as defenders of the homeland against foreign invaders. However, after the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021, something surprising happened. The Taliban, rather than seek revenge or escalate conflict, announced intentions to form a stable government and refrain from reprisals. According to human rights organizations, civilian killings dropped sharply, from over 8,000 in 2021 to fewer than 500 by the end of 2023. While still controversial, this suggests that once the invader disappears, the violent momentum of many extremist groups may diminish. This raises a difficult question. Could the U.S. military presence, originally intended as a protective force, have been, in some cases, an invisible catalyst for violence?
America's retreat has left behind a power vacuum. But it's not always filled by China or Russia. In some instances, it has allowed sidelined regional organizations to step forward and take charge. The African Union, AU, is one such example. In the conflict in Sudan, with no major power stepping in, the AU played the role of mediator, bringing rival factions to the table and brokering an initial ceasefire agreement. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN is increasingly expected to lead on regional issues, particularly tensions in the South China Sea. While major breakthroughs remain elusive, the absence of overwhelming superpower pressure has forced member states to talk more seriously among themselves rather than relying on external forces. In the Middle East, some analysts suggest that America's pullback could pave the way for an intra-regional security model, where countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey assume greater responsibility for maintaining regional stability, rather than depending on America's nuclear umbrella.
Without a dominant superpower framing peace processes, diplomacy in many regions could become more flexible. Instead of being shaped by external interests, peace deals may be negotiated more locally, tailored to regional conditions and cultural realities. However, this flexibility also comes with risks. Without a strong and credible third party, agreements can collapse if trust erodes. Without America acting as the stick, regional bodies or middle powers may lack the necessary influence to enforce commitments. Indeed, there have been multiple instances where peace agreements fell apart within months due to a lack of enforcement. For example, the 2022 ceasefire in Libya, brokered under EU auspices, quickly unraveled when local factions no longer feared U.S. retaliation or intervention.
All of this leads to a critical question. Is the U.S. withdrawing to give space for a multipolar world to emerge? Or is it simply walking away from its responsibilities? In some places, this may open the door to genuine peace, where local actors resolve conflicts without foreign interference. In others, it may invite opportunistic powers to fill the vacuum with violence, authoritarianism, or chaos. America's retreat from global intervention is not merely a military or political maneuver. It is a tectonic shift that shakes the foundations of global geopolitics. And when the old center withdraws, new forces will inevitably reshape the world, in their own image. Whether that world will be more just or more unstable remains an open question. In the realm of international politics, a power vacuum never lasts for long. Once the world's top superpower, the United States, begins to scale back its global presence, other forces inevitably rush in to fill the void. Not just for opportunity, but for strategic necessity. So the question is, who will fill the space left behind by the United States? Will it be China, with global ambitions? Russia, driven by a longing for imperial revival? Or non-state actors, armed, extremist, and lurking in the shadows? After a period of post-Soviet stagnation, Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has gradually reasserted itself as a major player, particularly in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, long considered America's strategic backyard. One clear example is Syria. When the U.S. began reducing its military presence in 2018 under President Trump, Russia quickly expanded its operations. It established the Khmeimim Air Base, supported the Assad regime with military training, air power, and advanced air defense systems like the S-300 and S-400. Beyond Syria, Russia has also increased its influence in Libya, Mali, and Sudan, largely through private military contractors like the Wagner Group. These forces don't just fight, they protect mineral assets, control transport routes, and meddle in domestic politics. Like, America's retreat has essentially served as a green light for Moscow to expand its soft power through weapons, energy, and an anti-Western model of governance. Unlike Russia, China rarely engages in direct military intervention. Instead, it pursues a quieter yet deeper strategy, expanding its influence through infrastructure, investment, trade, and technology. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is a clear illustration. From Pakistan and Sri Lanka to Africa and Eastern Europe, China has built a network of roads, ports, and energy projects, creating a soft, strategic belt encircling regions once dominated by American influence. In addition, Beijing has increasingly asserted itself militarily in the Indo-Pacific, establishing a naval base in Djibouti, signing a security pact with the Solomon Islands, and ramping up drills in the South China Sea all signal China's quiet assumption of roles in spaces where the U.S. has stepped back.
And in these gaps, China is redefining international norms, from digital power and maritime law to models of authoritarian development.
Iran must also be considered, arguably the master of filling the vacuum through proxy warfare. As the US withdrew from Iraq, reduced its footprint in Syria, and exited the JCPOA nuclear deal, Iran seized the moment to expand its influence via proxies like Hezbollah, Lebanon, the Houthis, Yemen, the PMF, Iraq, and Assad-aligned forces in Syria. The result is a Shia crescent stretching from Tehran to the Mediterranean, allowing Iran to control supply routes, influence energy security, and gain leverage in negotiations with the West. With America absent, Iran has grown bolder, ramping up uranium enrichment, testing ballistic missiles, and launching strikes against US and Israeli interests, either directly or through its proxies.
One of the most dangerous consequences of US withdrawal is when the vacuum isn't filled by nations, but by armed extremist non-state actors who play by no international rules. ISIS is the most prominent example. After the US left Iraq in 2011, the group surged, capturing cities and declaring a so-called caliphate, carrying out terrorist attacks across the globe. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Boko Haram in Nigeria, and rebel factions in Libya and Yemen have all capitalized on the absence of American power, in some cases controlling territory and functioning like de facto states. With no enforcer of order, the world risks falling into a chaotic survival of the fittest dynamic.
The US withdrawal has left many traditional allies on edge. Japan and South Korea have significantly increased their defense budgets. Israel has acted more unilaterally in Gaza and Lebanon. Smaller Southeast Asian nations are searching for new anchors, in some cases moving closer to China or Russia. The danger here isn't just fractured alliances, but a longer-term shift where smaller states choose, quote, the more useful partner, end quote, over the more principled one. And that could gradually alter the global balance of power.
When America withdraws, the power vacuum is not left empty. It is filled in unpredictable ways. It can be strategic expansion, covert entrenchment, or outright disorder. And the most unsettling truth is this: the world may remain unstable, but this time, there may be no one strong enough to intervene.
For decades, a military alliance with the United States was seen as a strategic insurance policy by many nations, from Asia and Europe to the Middle East. Washington's security commitments, mutual defense treaties, and its vast global network of military bases created an invisible shield that allowed allies to focus on development and, in some cases, neglect their own defense. But now, as the US begins to reduce its global intervention role, that sense of security is rapidly eroding. And many allies are beginning to ask, when the time comes, will America still be there? In 2021, when the US withdrew from Afghanistan, the image of helicopters departing the US Embassy in Kabul evoked painful memories of Saigon in 1975. It wasn't just the failure of a war. It was a brutal reminder that Washington can turn its back at any moment when its interests run dry. 2 years later, when the war in Ukraine erupted, the US provided Kyiv with weapons, funding, and intelligence, but firmly refused to send in troops. Washington did not want a direct war with Russia, even if it meant leaving Ukraine to fight alone on the battlefield. These two major events forced traditional allies to confront an uncomfortable but essential question. Can America's promise of protection still be trusted? In Asia, where China's assertiveness continues to rise, doubts about US security commitments are driving unprecedented shifts. Japan, which maintained a pacifist constitution for nearly 80 years, decided in 2023 to increase its defense spending to 2% of GDP, a historic milestone. Tokyo also approved the development of long-range missiles and began rearming its navy with a more proactive deterrence posture. Similarly, South Korea, under pressure from North Korea and wary of America's shrinking role, has boosted its missile capabilities, developed independent defense systems, and even publicly discussed the possibility of building its own nuclear weapons. The Philippines, which once expelled US forces, has now signed new defense agreements allowing American troops to return, not out of full confidence, but out of fear that no one else is strong enough to deter China in the South China Sea. While NATO remains the most robust military alliance in modern history, member trust in the US was shaken, especially during Donald Trump's presidency. He openly threatened to withdraw from NATO if European countries didn't pay their share for defense. The Ukraine war further exposed that vulnerability. Though the US has been the largest contributor to Kyiv,
Europe realized just how deeply it depended on Washington. In response, Germany, traditionally cautious about military matters, announced the largest rearmament package since World War II. Other EU nations have begun to talk seriously about strategic autonomy, once dismissed as a fantasy, in preparation for a world where America might not show up.
Israel is a prime example of a close ally growing increasingly anxious. As the US becomes more cautious in its involvement in Gaza and Lebanon, Tel Aviv has become more assertive and independent, often launching strikes against Hamas or Hezbollah without waiting for Washington's green light, even at the risk of complicating relations with Iran or inflaming regional tensions. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two of Washington's key Gulf allies, have started to diversify their alliances. They've moved closer to China, restored ties with Iran, and even signed energy deals with Russia. These shifts don't necessarily mean they are abandoning the US, but they no longer want to rely on it as their sole protector.
As trust declines, the alliance structure built by the US begins to crack. Allies are now developing independent strategies, forging new partnerships, or even playing both sides, cooperating with the US while also engaging with its rivals if it serves their interests. This makes the world more unpredictable and multipolar. If Washington isn't careful, it may gradually lose its central role in the global security architecture it once created. In short, withdrawing from interventionism isn't just a military decision. It's a matter of trust. And in a volatile world, trust is the most valuable currency. Once lost, it's incredibly hard to restore.
For the past 70 years, US military power and global influence have served as a gravitational center of the international order. Not because every country liked Washington, but because everyone feared provoking it. That was the power of deterrence. A fragile but effective balance where potential adversaries knew to avoid crossing the red line of a superpower. But as the US scales back its interventions, that deterrent force has weakened. And as deterrence fades, the world grows bolder, more fractured, and more dangerous than ever. The South China Sea, Taiwan, and the East China Sea, long held in a state of no war, no peace, are now heating up daily. China has escalated its military actions to unprecedented levels, building artificial islands, deploying anti-ship missiles, cutting undersea cables, shadowing foreign naval ships, and conducting mock encirclement drills around Taiwan. Beijing's boldness is no coincidence. America's reduced patrols, fewer carrier deployments during sensitive periods, and slow responses to maritime incidents have been perceived by China as weakness, and in Beijing's doctrine, opportunity knocks only once. When Washington hesitates, China pushes forward. Even without full-blown war, China's incursions into Vietnam and the Philippines' exclusive economic zones or exercises near Japanese waters are clear signs of a shifting order, where international law is weaker than military force. Before 2022, the West believed that sanctions and limited military aid would be enough to deter Russia. Then Vladimir Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, completely shattering the old deterrence model. Although the US increased support for Kyiv with weapons and intelligence, it has refused to send troops. From the Kremlin's point of view, this signaled that the US is not willing to die for Kyiv, a harsh but realistic message. The result has been a prolonged and brutal war, with hundreds of thousands of casualties, millions of refugees, and Europe facing its worst security crisis since World War II. The biggest fear isn't just Russia, but the precedent. If Russia can invade Ukraine without direct US military intervention, might China try the same with Taiwan? The erosion of deterrence doesn't only embolden major powers, it unleashes non-state actors. Armed groups, terrorists, traffickers, pirates, all of whom once feared US intervention, now see little reason to hold back. In the Middle East, groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis have grown more aggressive. In Africa, terrorist organizations like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and ISIS West Africa control hundreds of square kilometers, forcing local militaries to seek aid from Russia or China. Without America as a major player, extremist groups face fewer checks, resulting in increased violence, instability, migration, and humanitarian crises across conflict zones. Ironically, America remains the most powerful nation militarily, with unmatched technology and the ability to project force globally within hours. But it's the hesitation, caution, and ambiguity in recent decision-making that have made adversaries question Washington's willingness to act. In deterrence, what matters most isn't firepower, but the willingness to use it. And that's what the US is increasingly seen as lacking.
No one is sure if the US would act if an ally were attacked. No one knows whether Washington would risk an election, a stock market crash, or a trade deal to respond to a military crisis. And that uncertainty creates the biggest risk of all. Deterrence fails, and war becomes not just possible, but likely. Not because anyone wants it, but because everyone assumes the other side won't respond.
As American presence and decisiveness decline, the world is not becoming more peaceful, only more unpredictable. No one is fully in control. And when the rules are left open, the strongest player isn't the one with the most principles, but the one most willing to gamble it all. The United States' retreat from its global interventionist policy marks a historic turning point, not only in military strategy, but in the deep restructuring of how this superpower defines its role and influence in the 21st century. Yet a vital question remains. Is this an inevitable decline, or is it a calculated step back to leap further forward in a rapidly changing world? From a positive perspective, America's withdrawal from prolonged wars may help reset the global order toward a more equitable, multipolar reality. Without a single superpower intervening in every geopolitical corner, nations, regions, and international institutions may finally have room to shape their own futures. Organizations like the African Union, AU, ASEAN, the European Union, and the United Nations can now act as independent mediators, no longer overshadowed by Washington. Regional peace initiatives, intra-bloc security frameworks, and local diplomacy, once marginalized by overwhelming U.S. power, may now become pillars of a new, softer, more sustainable peace. More importantly, America's step back forces nations to become more self-reliant, building their own defense capabilities, strengthening domestic economies, and defining their core interests without dependency on a single global enforcer. For years, U.S. presidents, from Obama to Trump to Biden, have acknowledged a stark reality. America has spent far too much on foreign wars, while its infrastructure, healthcare, education, and social fabric at home have steadily deteriorated. Withdrawing from global hotspots allows Washington to save hundreds of billions of dollars, avoid long-standing political divisions over military interventions, and, more crucially, invest in the future. AI, clean energy, space technology, and post-COVID economic restructuring. This is not surrender. It's a strategic reallocation of resources, a necessary pivot for any pragmatic superpower seeking to survive in an era of multidimensional competition. However, overestimating the benefits of withdrawal could be dangerous. For decades, U.S. presence, controversial as it may have been, helped maintain stability in many regions. Without America, conflicts may spiral into chaos. Fragile democracies may fall to armed extremism. Smaller nations may be coerced or dominated by regional powers. And strategic trade routes like the South China Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, or the Black Sea may become unstable without a reliable security guarantor. A world without America does not mean peace. It may simply mean a world without a referee. And in that vacuum, anyone can rewrite the rules. That might be China with its authoritarian model, Russia with its aggressive interventions, or even non-state armed groups with radical ideologies. If America's withdrawal is merely a surrender, it risks losing both its influence and its credibility. But if it's part of a deliberate strategy, the U.S. can reshape its global role more effectively. It doesn't have to send troops to every front line. Washington can maintain influence through technology, economic power, and its alliance networks, prevent conflicts using proxies, strategic aid, and smart diplomacy, assert moral leadership by spearheading global efforts, from climate change to AI regulation and pandemic preparedness. Most importantly, America must withdraw responsibly, without leaving power vacuums for anti-democratic forces, without abandoning allies, and without making the world feel like it's been left to chaos. History has no room for naivete. A retreating America may look like a weakening one, or it may be a sign of strategic reinvention. It all depends on how Washington chooses to position itself in the New World Order. If America still wants to be the one writing the rules, it must learn to write them with a keyboard, not just with missiles. It must learn to lead through alliances, not isolation, through values, not just strength. A step back may indeed lead to 3 steps forward, but only if you know where you're going.